All right, here we go. Today we're talking about the Yeti 160E. It is Yeti's very first e-bike, and they took their sweet time making this thing. They say that it's so that they could get it right. So did they? We're not going to cover all of the geometry and specs, just go Google that. Couple key features on this bike. It is a 160mm rear, 170mm front e-bike. It uses the Shimano EP8 motor. So that's the full power, big bad Larry e-bike motor, 85 Newton meters. It has a 630 watt hour battery. This is a full-on heavyweight e-bike. It's got a lot of power and it's got a lot of range. Today I am riding the T1 build with the carbon wheel upgrade. So it is top dog. Nothing is better. It comes with all of the best components you could ever ask for, and it's pretty sweet. So Yeti claims that this is the first race-specific e-bike on the market. As part of that, they have foregone the Switch Infinity suspension platform that we all know and love in favor of Sixfinity. Yeti designed this thing to give you a ton of traction and to be super fast, so we're gonna jump out on the trail and see how it goes.
All right, here we go on the Yeti SB. Ooh, not the SB. It is just the Yeti 160E. Ooh, that's cool. This rolls on the Shimano EP8 motor. It is the full power Bad Larry, so there is a ton of power on offer here. Overall weight on this guy is close to 50. I think it's about 51 pounds. So definitely not light, not terrible. So on the climbs here, the Geo is actually really comfortable. It's honestly one of the most natural feeling bikes I've jumped on recently with how comfortable that seated position feels. The bars don't feel as far away as I would have guessed with the long reach. So I think there's a bit of steep seat tube action going on here, bringing you a little bit closer to the front end, but it just feels really comfortable. On an e-bike, you're a little bit more limited by the amount of traction the bike can produce. Where on a normal mountain bike, it's the power, it's your own legs. But here you've got a lot of power. There's really nothing that you don't have enough power to get up. It becomes all about traction and keeping that rear wheel driving the bike forward. So Yeti's made the bike just a little bit less efficient, or reduced that anti-squat just a little bit on the pedaling platform in favor of giving you more traction. And overall, that's gonna keep the bike climbing up tougher, harder, steeper stuff, because there's plenty of power on offer. So I think that's a pretty solid strategy for making the e-bike climb a little bit better. Sometimes they can be a little bit heavy, a little bit cumbersome. So having that traction where you can just keep spinning and charge through anything really helps them climb pretty well. So the handling on this bike, for it being big, bulky, the handling is actually really nice. It's pretty quick, pretty snappy. It feels like your weight's pretty aggressively over that front end, which helps you steer and maneuver and navigate tighter stuff a little bit better. I think it was pretty wise to not go ultra slack on that head tube angle. By keeping that head tube angle just a little bit steeper and making the steering more responsive, you're able to kind of counteract that heavy, cumbersome feel. One thing I've noticed is the suspension moves very effectively. What I mean by that is the back end doesn't get hung up on little rocks and bumps and ledges. This bike just motors, well, it does have a motor, but it just motors through the rocks. It's not getting hung up. You can just kind of keep pedaling, and it just goes like the rocks aren't even there. Woo-hoo-hoo. All right, starting out on the slightly easier, more flowy trail here. First thing I'm noticing is this bike is very responsive. It's heavy, it's 50-something pounds, but it feels pretty snappy and maneuverable and agile. I think that suspension is designed to give you a lot of support. It's not just a gooey plush factory here. Plenty of support for jumps, corners, pumping. After all, this is a race bike. Yeti makes race bikes. And you can feel that in this bike. You can feel that suspension that helps you generate speed on the trail. So just like on the climbs, where you're up over the front of the bike just a little bit more because of that slightly steeper head tube angle, that keeps the bike pretty responsive. And I think it's in an effort to kind of counteract, a big, heavy, bulky bike. I do feel like my weight is kind of over the front of the bike, maybe a bit more than I'm used to, especially riding the bikes I have been recently. But it does make the bike just feel really lively, responsive, snappy. I don't feel sketched out by it. I don't think it's that steep, but I think it's just enough to kind of counteract that big, bulky e-bike feel. I even noticed the first couple of corners out today, I was oversteering quite a bit. I could feel myself steering just a little too much, cutting the corners just a little too tight. Woo! That was deep. Goodness gracious. So like I was saying earlier, the suspension is really well supported. It's not ultra plush and it doesn't feel harsh. It just kind of sits in the middle. It's very well supported the entire way through the stroke. I think if I were getting into some really rocky, nasty terrain, I'd maybe like that suspension feel a little bit softer. And one really cool thing with this bike is you can tune the progression with a flip chip. Most flip chips adjust geometry. Here they adjust how much progression you get. And I'm in the middle mode right now, but I think if I got on some really nasty terrain, I'd jump it up into that 35% mode and then take a little bit of air out of the shock to make the initial stroke a little bit softer, but still have plenty of bottom out control for big nasty hits. And speaking of big nasty hits, this bike's been handling them really well. There's a semi-hefty drop up here, and I've gone deep off it both times today, and it soaks that up fairly nicely. Whoo! Slid out there. Yeti's really thought through this thing. And one thing I've noticed that they've really thought through is sound. So e-bikes tend to be pretty noisy. Most of the time they sound like a shopping cart rolling down a mountain. And this does have a little bit of the rattle in the motor, but other than that, this bike is pretty freaking quiet, which for an e-bike is not common. So if you're a very sound sensitive person and you hate noises on your bike, you'd like this. Should we eye up this sketchy double instead of riding off the end? A little pop or a yank from here. Oh, overshoot of a lifetime right there. Jeez. All right. Hell of a day on a bike. Could not be happier. So this is Zach's bike. And I might just skip town, head to Mexico and keep this thing.
All right, we're back. Couple key takeaways from the ride impressions. On the climbs, the bike is super comfortable and it's very, very fast. Like I said earlier, the limit on an e-bike isn't so much power. There's plenty of power on offer. It's how much traction you can provide, because all the power in the world does you no good if the back wheel's just spinning. So the Sixfinity platform does give you a lot of traction to keep driving the bike forward. Also, the handling is very quick and responsive, and that's great for technical climbs. You're able to kind of maneuver the bike in and out of twists and turns and over and around all the obstacles in the trail. On the downhills, the number one thing that impressed me about this bike was the handling. The suspension is great, the geometry is great, but what really, really impressed on this bike was the handling. It is so good around a corner. It is insane how well this bike leans over, how well it gets through a corner. It lets you really maneuver this bike, and it's a big, heavy bike. It is. It's 51.5 pounds or so. But the responsive handling kind of counteracts that. You don't really feel like you're riding this giant e-bike. That is my #1 favorite thing about it. All right, so the question you came to have answered, is the 160E the right bike for you? I think this bike really rewards the type of rider who wants to have a lot of input in how their bike rides. They're not just hanging on for dear life in passenger mode. It's plenty capable, there's plenty of travel to kind of let you hang on in passenger mode from time to time. But I think you're missing out on a lot of what this bike has to offer if you're doing that. This bike is so good at pumping, so good at cornering. If you've got a little lip, it's actually very good at jumping. So it's just a very responsive, fun ride. I think about Jared Graves. He had a lot of input in designing this bike. Jared raced downhill, 4-cross, BMX, EWS. The dude's a racer, and he raced a very wide variety of disciplines. And I think that comes through in this bike. So final takeaway on the 160E, I think the long wait was worth it. So thanks for sticking around. See you next time.